Hello, you're listening to episode 51 of the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast. Today's session is going to be about the one-off interview. There's a lot of interest at the moment about single session therapy, and this is about the PCP way that you might do that piece of work. A really useful reference for this is Tom Ravenette's paper, Personal Construct Psychology and the Assessment of Young People, the one-off interview. Now, although it was written about his work with young people in a remand home, as it was called then, it also applies to working with anybody in a single session. What Tom says is that he made it clear in his work with the organisation he was working with that his assessment was to help the staff. And that was the social workers who were working with the young people, but also the residential care staff and the teachers. And what he was helping them to do was to understand that young person. But he suggests that anything that we do to understand a young person is also potentially of benefit for them, as well as for the people we're trying to help work with them. And I would agree absolutely with that. The impact of any kind of therapeutic work is much wider than the person you're trying to help. So Tom says, the essential point about the one-off interview is that it will happen only once. This is in contrast to the ongoing nature of therapeutic counselling or supportive interviews, where there is a continuity from one interview to the next. There is a tacit or overt concession that the young person has a problem, and that there is time to let the client take the lead with minimum intervention from the interviewer. Consequently, the one-off interview needs to have a structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end, in order to promote the meaningfulness of the event for the young person, but also to maximise the efficient use of time. The next thing he says applies to every person that we would work with. In particular, he's talking about young people because they often receive any help at the request of adults rather than their own request. And I often think I would like this on my wall. The young person is not an object to be weighed and measured against some psychometric yardstick or theoretical model. He is a live human being, operating his own personality theory, having thoughts, feelings and strivings, and living in interaction with his environment, and this includes a residential setting in which he currently finds himself. He goes on to say that the interview will be an exploration of some of the ways in which the young person makes sense of himself and his circumstances. As a consequence, because this involves the young person taking a close look at himself, it will also, paradoxically, be a form of personal self-assessment. And Tom goes on to say that there are certain things that are implied by using personal construct psychology in this. And he just reminds us of the value of PCP and the relationship to our work with the theory. He outlines 4 things, and he says, firstly, it is a central tenet of the theory that what people do is, amongst other things, very much a matter of how they make sense of themselves and their circumstances. In abstract terms, this is their construction of themselves and the world. The world in this context is a subjective world of personal action, interaction, and experience. So the young person is existing within a context, and they're making their best sense of what goes on around them and how that affects them, and the way they are in relation to their experiences. He goes on to say, secondly, a sense of self is crucial in understanding an individual's encounters with life, because people have a fairly clear notion of those actions and attitudes of which they would say, that is just not me. This sense of self includes, at varying levels of awareness, consciousness of one's own thoughts, feelings, strivings, and actions, real and imagined. It includes core and peripheral notions of who I am, the invalidation of which can cause the individual to suffer respectively serious psychological distress or minor irritation. So that person is existing within a world that they have construed, but they are construing themselves as well, and their sense of who they are is crucial to how they interact with that world. Tom goes on to say, thirdly, at a practical level, the theory is profoundly concerned with meaning. What is the personal sense that a person makes of events? What are his or her constructions? There are, however, practical difficulties here. The theory, at a highly abstract level, deals with constructs and construct systems. It is an essential feature of the theory that constructs are two-ended and are based on similarities and contrasts. A descriptive assertion requires for its amplification some statement of what that assertion also denies, i.e., its contrast. And the search for these personal contrasts is an important part of interviewing. So he's reminding us that when we're exploring constructs, a construct is not the single pole that might come out of somebody's mouth. So, for instance, if they say, I'm fed up with being here, our question will be, as opposed to what? What would the contrast to that be? If you were not fed up with being here, what would you be instead? He also goes on to remind us of the danger of assuming that everyone has the communication skills that they can use to explain their construing. And we know from working with people that that is really not the case. So we need alternative ways to explore things. He gives a nice analogy to remind us that the construct is not the words. The construct is the construing. The words are the way we label that construing in order to communicate it to somebody else. So he says, by analogy, a buoy at sea might indicate underwater hazards or sunken treasure, but is itself neither the hazard nor the treasure. The implication follows that the pursuit of an individual's personal, as opposed to his purely verbal constructs, should not rest with the superficial elicitation of words, but should include some exploration of what those words imply. For example, I would say if we were talking to somebody who described themselves as lonely, we might want to say, so how would you describe someone who's not lonely? And they might say, sociable and has lots of friends. Now, that doesn't tell us anything about the implications of that. The implications are how that would play out and what are the constructs it's connected to. So is lonely a core construct? Is it a peripheral? Likely, probably quite core or quite superior in terms of the construct system to other constructs. However, we might want to know if that person stopped being lonely, what would that look like? And if the person's explanation said, well, that'll never change because I don't know how to talk to people, that implies something very different than if somebody said, well, I'd have to move to an area that's nearer to people rather than living in the countryside. The implications, therefore, of using a word to describe a construct is completely different and entirely personal. Tom says the fourth issue drawn from theory is the principle of constructive alternativism, which means quite simply, there is always at least one other way of seeing things. The value of this principle is that it provides an aim for the assessment interview. Can a young person come to some alternative sense of himself and his circumstances, thereby creating the possibility of freeing himself at some point in the future of the burden of those past constructions out of which his actions have arisen? At the same time, the corollary also obtains, might it be possible that the other professionals who are involved may also see the young person in a different light in their ongoing dealings with him? These theoretical considerations now provide a logic and a purpose for the one-off assessment interview. It may be a statement of the obvious, but it is worth restating that the basic tool in the interview is the question. To quote Kelly, a pat answer is the enemy to a fresh question, but the inverse also applies. A pat question is the enemy to a fresh answer. Obviously, if you're using particular tools to do your interviews and questionnaires, you've got to ask the question that's there. And that would be my argument for not doing so. Will those tools help us to understand a lot more about that person? Or would it be better to have a conversation with them that's a bit more wide-ranging? One of the difficulties with this is the anxiety that the professional might feel about what's going to come up and how they will make sure it's useful. And sometimes using particular tools can give you a false sense of security in that regard, that we assume that the outcomes will be useful to us. And then when we look at it, we think, well, I still don't know why they do those things and what their experience is on the inside of being a person who, for instance, is not able to do certain things. So the question that we ask is absolutely crucial. That doesn't mean that you have to get the question right, in inverted commas, first time. Sometimes the right question comes along during a conversation and realise as a professional that you could have asked it a different way and got a slightly different answer. So over time you get better at thinking, okay, well, it's all right to change your question and ask again, maybe later on in the interview, that same question, or ask for clarification. That's not a sign of failure, that's a sign of working with individuals in a very tailored way. Tom says the value of the question is that, at its most effective, it sets off those internal thought and feeling processes that are the beginnings of a personal self-assessment. He goes on to say that this points to the value of a self-assessment that asks the person first of all about who they are. So a self-description. Now you can do that in particular ways. You can use some techniques. Drawing the ideal self is one of those things. And you can use Tom's "Who are you?" technique. But remember, in terms of personal construct psychology, you can also invent techniques that suit you and your style because you're connecting back to the theory. You're thinking, okay, so what I'm asking here is to find some way of understanding that person and a self-assessment. What are the ways that I can do that? And for some people you can do it in words, for other people you might need to do it in actions, and I've talked about that previously on this podcast. The advantage of using a particular tool to do this, Tom says, is it gives you some structure and some shape to an interview. And there are tools that you can use that don't require you to have drawings or things like that, so you're tailoring it to the person that you're working with. He suggests that there are some particular things to bear in mind here, and the first thing is not to ask for one answer to a question, but for three. The effect of this is quite interesting. It recognises the possibility of more than one answer to the question, which may be a relief for the interviewee in not having to find the right one. At the same time, it is an effective challenge to the pat answer, usually the first that is given, but requiring a search for the second and third. Experience shows that not infrequently finding the third answer proves to be very difficult, thereby fulfilling the purpose of the question in promoting an inner search. So if you've used Drawing the Ideal Self, you will see that more than one thing is asked about the person. And also, when you're starting it and you're asking for a description of that person, it asks for 3 descriptions. And by habit now, I would ask for 3 things. It's easier to do as you get used to doing it. At first, it can feel a bit over the top, maybe. But I really do think that the third answer can be really illuminating. So Tom goes on to say that the next thing you would do is ask for contrasts to what has been said. So how would you describe a person not like that? What sort of situation would be the opposite of the one you have described? You say that is important to you. How would you describe someone who says it is not important? I like that question at the end. I think that's a really nice one because you're distancing it a little bit from the person. By the time you've done that, you've got quite a lot of detailed information already. And for every question you ask a person, if you always think about what's the contrast to it, you've got other things you can explore. So you've already got two poles to a construct. You can explore them both and have a really fruitful conversation. The next thing Tom suggests is to ask for the importance of the relevance of an observation in the life of the interviewee, and then to pursue that to more and more fundamental levels. The basic question is that important to you? Followed by, and that, and that. The use of subsequent non-motivational how come then aims to find some of the experiential bases for these answers. Each of these is intended to serve the purpose of leading to some clarification of the ways an individual makes sense of things. To put into words what has been hidden or ill-formulated, or half-sensed, is to allow a degree of self-understanding, and therefore, to put into words what has been hidden or ill-formulated, or half-sensed, is to allow a degree of self-understanding and, therefore, also a self-direction that was not previously possible. This can sometimes further be achieved by putting forward for acceptance or rejection constructive hypotheses that attempt to link meaningfully some of the material that the interview has brought forth. These are not necessarily alternative constructions, although they may be, but they provide a view of how things seem to be, and this may be a starting point for the young person to offer a different presentation of self to the outside world. And I have to say, I would pretty much always do that. I'd be thinking about what the person had been telling me and offering alternative constructions and presenting those constructions with a kind of curiosity and, I wonder if comment in front of it. So it might be, I wonder if the fact that you say you've always been lonely is something that you were aware of when you were a child or not, and whether it bothered you as a child. I would say that's something I pretty much always do, because I think people should leave an interview experience with offers of alternative constructions, particularly for the things that they feel uncomfortable about in terms of their sense of self. That sometimes I might say, it's interesting that you're saying that, but hearing what you've said, I might think that what you're describing is somebody who's very persistent and tries really hard, when they might have put themselves down in all kinds of ways in the interview. And in terms of feeding back the information about the interview to adults involved with a young person or to other people involved with the person you're working with, what Tom says is, from an assessment point of view, the sharing of the information in the interview with the other professionals makes possible their altered constructions of the young person. This in turn may lead them to communicating with him in ways that respect rather than ignore or invalidate his sense of self. What we're trying to do here is to help other people to develop alternative constructions of that person, to understand them better, to know them in a way that they didn't know them before the interview. Now, this is particularly important for anybody who's in a situation where other people are the people who've referred them. So that might be somebody who's in some kind of care, but also for children and young people, they aren't normally the person who's asked for any help. And they aren't in a position of power. They might not be able to change anything at all that could help people to help them. So I would always say to young people at the beginning, my aim of my involvement is to understand you better and to hear what you've got to say about the things that have happened, and to be able to help other people to help you better because of it. Now, that means that I might need to speak to them afterwards, but first of all, I want to talk to you, and then we'll discuss what I will say to the other people. I haven't normally had difficulties with young people saying, well, you're not allowed to share that. As long as you explain clearly what it is that you're going to share, it might also involve showing things like pictures or diagrams or explanations that we've developed in the session, because I think the seeing of information that has been recently live is actually really helpful to people, that they can get a quicker picture than just a conversation. Typically, I would ask young people if they want to take the stuff away with them as well, in which case I would give them a copy. So Tom goes on to give a beautiful case study of a piece of work that he did with a young person. And when you read it, you think, oh my word, that guy was quite a genius to be able to do that. He can ask questions really, really well, and he can use the information he gets back from a young person to weave together beautifully. So it's worth reading, definitely. Anyway, he goes on to conclude, within the personal construct psychology framework, Kelly suggests that it might be useful to take the client's words seriously and allow that they may have some validity as an expression of his or her thoughts and feelings. We might then reflect on the totality of what he or she says in order to trace out any consistent patterns. So looking at what we've got is going to help us to communicate that back to the other people involved. In this case, the people who are working with this young person. If we don't take that time to look at it and make sense, we might miss something really crucial. So we're observing to see if what's been said and done in that session has got particular patterns in it in the way things are construed. So I did some work with a young person who described everybody as tall or fast. Those kind of things were really, really useful to feedback to the teachers who saw him as having a behavioural problem when actually he had a construing problem. Not surprisingly, as a personal construct therapist, I would think that. But, he couldn't construe people in psychological ways very easily. He had a diagnosis of autism, but people with autism have widely varying abilities to do that. So you can't make any assumptions there. But he was particularly poor at construing people. He could construe other things okay, but with people, he was basing his constructions on their physical size. No wonder then that if there was any threat that was physical, he would be running out of the way or getting into a fight. Not surprising. So Tom's final comment is, my conclusion is very short. Kelly puts forward as part of the formal theory the sociality corollary, which reads, to the extent that one person construes the construction processes of another, he may play a role in the social processes involving the other person. In more ordinary language, it is not so much a matter of understanding other people, which may indeed be patronising, but of understanding how they arrived at where they are. This implies respect for their individuality and transcends the question of agreement or disagreement, approval or disapproval. As I see it, the one-off assessment interview represents the putting into action of this corollary and is therefore an exemplar of the use of personal construct psychology in the assessment process. I think this brings us to two important conclusions. One is that if you can find ways to tailor your interview and to ask really good searching questions, do something useful in that interview. And that usefulness may be to the people who have referred, or also to the client themselves, but also to the subject of the referral, the person that you're doing the work with. Without that, your understanding of the person won't be elaborated, and their understanding of themselves won't be either. The second important thing is that a change in construing is closely connected to a change in behaviour. This is what a construct implies, that a construct is about the way of seeing the world. So if your way of understanding the world changes, what you do in it will also change. Now, usually when someone's referred, this is exactly what is desired. There's no point referring people if you don't think it's going to be any use. Although I have seen those referrals. But I think that if you're doing a piece of work and you've only got one session, it doesn't mean you can't use PCP. It means that what you've got to do is really hone those skills of asking really good questions, and doing something useful in a single session is entirely possible. What you might do is go for the model of, if you're doing this in therapy, one at a time therapy. Let's have one session, see what you make of it, reflect on it, put some things into action that you've decided are important, and then come back and talk to me again at a point that you would like to. That's a really valid use of everybody's time, because you're allowing that time in between. What it might not do is suit everybody, but there'll always be people that suits really well. So people who don't have a lot of time, people who want to mull things over between sessions. The other thing that you might do is go and look at Windy Dryden's work on single session or one at a time therapy. That is really good. There's stuff on YouTube and I'll put a link to it. You can also have training in single session work, and it is really about you have the single session, you're working on things that are relevant to the person, and you are in at the end of that session. They're going to go away with some things that they might try out, and they have time then to do that and come back if they would like to for another of the one at a time therapy. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I will put the reference to Tom's paper in the show notes, and I will see you again next month. Okay, bye.